In the early spring of 2017, at a leadership development training in Maxwell, Texas, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez announced to a small group of colleagues and myself that she would be seeking election to the U.S. House to represent the 14th Congressional District of New York as a primary challenger against incumbent Democrat Joe Crowley. Since then, she has been at the forefront of one of the most talked about and exciting campaigns in the country. I sat down with Alexandria to discuss some of her inspirations and influences, her views on policy, and what it's been like to try to run a campaign based on social movement politics and community values. This is Politics and Chill. One of the forefront figures of the progressive movement right now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Hi! Hey everyone, and hey Andrès, it's so great to be here.
So awesome.
I mean, we can't even pretend to sometimes be professional in a way because Andrès and I go back a long time. So it's great to be here as friends and as fellow activists here in the space.
And here's the crazy thing, and kind of like how I'd like to get started. Around a year ago, you and I were in the middle of Texas on a ranch, experiencing encounters with the
third kind,
the paranormal, right there in Maxwell, Texas.
It was an educational retreat, everybody.
Yes. So what a lot of people don't know is that Alexandria and I have both been trained by the National Hispanic Institute since the time that we were in high school.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to get started hearing a little bit about your experiences with NHI and just in general kind of growing up, the fundamental things that shaped your thinking, your vision, who you are and why you do what you do.
Yeah, I think that my experience with the National Hispanic Institute has been so profound for my development because when I was a young person, when I was in high school, when I was a teenager, no one had really asked me how I felt the world should be,
Right.
And nobody asks young people that. People tell young people what to think, they tell young people what is right and what is wrong, and very rarely as a young person did I ever encounter an older individual that said, if you had the keys, not just to your own life, but if you had the keys to your community, what would you do? How would you transform it? And when you plant that seed of ownership and leadership in a child when they are very young, it really transforms their worldview, and it almost kind of unlocks this belief that, oh wait, the things I do actually do impact the world, and I actually have an intrinsic power just by being a person on this earth. I can move other people, I can convince my friends to do something, and I can organize individuals. And to have that realization when you are young is profoundly important for communities and to kind of start establishing a worldview to lead.
Absolutely, and it's like not only did we receive this really powerful training, educational training as Latinos, but then growing up in our 20s and as young adults, we were launched into these programs where we were doing project management and working with undergraduates and working with high school students to put together the same programs that impacted us.
Yeah.
Say a little bit about your experiences in those leadership capacities as a young person.
Well, I often reference my experience as an educational director with the National Hispanic Institute on the campaign trail because it has been my work with young people and with younger people that has driven and given me the drive on my campaign. Just working with high schoolers and then having that responsibility and to have families and parents kind of turn to me and turn to you and say, all right, here's my child, we're trusting you with them and with their development is so profound. And when you're doing that in your 20s, it seems like such an enormous responsibility. But when you trust young people with those kinds of capacities at a young age, they often rise to meet that challenge. And so it was a profoundly growing experience for me. It was an experience of increasing my skill and my skills in organizing for me. And, you know, at the end of the day, doing is the best way of learning. And I mean, running for office feels like I got a master's degree. Just like kind of doing things, throwing yourself into the fire and having that trial by fire, I think, is some of the best ways to learn.
I really resonate with that, especially this idea that as young people, we're often just told to follow along whatever authority is saying to you and follow the rules and kind of just, you know, live your life in a very status quo kind of way. But we're really taught to, from a very early age, think critically, think for ourselves, and engage with the world, that we are a part of creating that reality. So say a little bit about the cultural piece, right? As an American, but also with a background being Puerto Rican and as a Latina, how has that shaped and influenced who you are and what you're bringing to the table?
It's so important. I was kind of thinking about this today because we're in a time in America where like topics of race and topics of gender and topics of identity make people feel like so explosive, right? And there's this question I get asked over and over again about identity politics. And to me, what makes no sense at all is the fact that I'm being asked about identity politics, but people like our president are not being accused of playing identity politics.
Right.
But he played identity politics more than anybody
else.
Time.
Right, yeah.
With the dog whistling and with the, you know, the way, you know, when you go out and when you talk a certain way and you act like you're some kind of Rust Belt native or something. That is peak identity politics right there. And for me, just to say that I'm trying to represent the American community that I come from is like somehow identity politics. Why? Like why? Because I'm not male, or because like is it only identity politics if you're a racial minority, or is it only identity politics if you're gender nonconforming or whatever?
Right.
But for me, what's really important is, you know, I come from a district that is 70% people of color, it's 60% Hispanic, it's 40% primarily Spanish speaking, and we don't have that representation in Congress. And way back in the day, so I grew up kind of between two worlds. I grew up half in the Bronx, and then I also grew up half going to public school 40 minutes north of the Bronx. And so in my public school, I was the only Latina, really like the only person of color, one of the only people of color in my grade. There were like maybe 4 or 5 students of color in a class of like 300, or like Latinos or African American students, I should say, in our class of like 300 or 400 students. And so when I was in that environment as a young person, I was kind of, I feel, conditioned to devalue my identity. I felt like I had to, I feel like I kind of subconsciously bought into the like we don't see color type of thing. But with that,
we're all the same.
We're all the same.
Right.
There's no such thing as race. Like, why do we care about race? And you know, as a very, very young person, only surrounded by people of that opinion, I like when I tried as a young person to integrate that into my own life, just because that's what everyone around me believed. I found that what that actually translated to is me being embarrassed to speak Spanish in public, me being embarrassed of my culture or of who I am, or to say that I'm Latina, and that is oppressive. It's oppressive. It's a really subconscious kind of nefarious way that works, and so it was really kind of my experiences still as a young person in my teenage years, when I really started to kind of delve deep into my own identity and delve deep into what it meant to be Puerto Rican. And that in and of itself is such a conflicted identity that I still struggle with it today. Like, am I doing it right? You know?
Right. Because
Puerto Rican people, our political status is in the air, you know? in some ways we have the privilege of being documented Americans, but in other ways we are born with no real political status. We're second-class citizens. We aren't allowed to vote in presidential elections. And when things like we just saw, Hurricane Maria hits, we are forgotten.
Right. And it's like so many Americans didn't even know that Puerto Rico was an American territory.
Yeah, and I grew up around that. Like, I grew up, like, you know, even as I run, you know, there'll be some trolls out there, and they'll be like, go back to whatever country you came from, or like, what country did you come from? And I was like, I was born here, and my family has been here since Native peoples. So,
yeah.
So I don't know where you're trying to get me to go.
Right.
But also kind of asserting the fact that as a person who is, you know, a United States citizen, my family has been U.S. citizens for generations, to assert that too is Latino is something that is important to me.
Right.
And something that's important to all of us, because we think of American history as one color or like one identity, but really when this nation was founded, there were already Native American people here, there were already, you know, Native American that turned into Hispanic people here. There were,
and that experience is very different for different people depending on what background you were from.
Right, exactly. And so it's really a continuous exploration, and I tried to kind of have a public conversation about it instead of it being a stance. Like, my identity is not a stance.
Right.
And I don't think identity in general is a stance. It's kind of it's an idea in a way, but it's also rooted. You know, it's real. It's not imagined, but it's something that I think every person starts to kind of add to and construct and discover about themselves.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things I think that has contributed to a little more depth in the conversation from identity politics, which is often viewed as just like, I'm this or I'm that, or I represent this, instead to what we often call intersectionality, right? Which is this idea that our identities and our experiences are socially constructed, and they have this place in the world, and they are real. They're socially constructed, and they're real in how they're politically manifested, and the way people experience life with institutions and all of these things. So along those lines, and I know one of the things that we often talk about is like this idea of social narratives, right? And discussing how there are social narratives that we have been kind of taught to believe. How you said to be ashamed to speak Spanish, or to be ashamed of being from this background or that background, and instead building and imagining the kind of social narratives that will transform people's lives, to see them that no matter where you are from, no matter what background you have a place in this society, not just to be a spectator, but to be a creative participant in this. What do you see being the social narratives that you're bringing to your campaign and to your communities?
I think that there are a couple of things. One is that one of the really basic core narratives that my campaign advances is you matter. You matter. Because in our community, in New York 14, where we have some of the lowest voter turnout in the country, where our elected officials are decided by default and by appointment and by basically lack of small d democratic process, so many people just feel like what they do, how they vote, whether they vote, what their opinions are, like, just doesn't matter. That the things that happen politically are just going to happen politically, and that they don't have agency in that process. And what this campaign really is about is that if you wake up, if you care, and if you wake up your brothers and your sisters, you wake up your family members and your friends, you can change society. And you can change society in our backyard, and you can change society nationally. And so a huge part, especially because there are so many, our district is so diverse. Our district is half immigrant, for example. Naturalized, not naturalized, undocumented, whatever, like all different statuses. But what we're here to say too, in a lot of our organizing, we organize people that have never really been organized in the American political process before. And so I'm not afraid to go to an undocumented person or to go to a DACA student or recipient and to say, you matter and I want you here at this table. To say, you have a place here in our democracy, that everyone has a place here in our democracy, and that the world is not zero sum. The world is not zero sum. The world has unlimited seats at the table.
Right.
And the more those seats are filled, the better off we are as a collective society. But at the very core, the thing that's gonna get someone from zero to a voting booth, in my opinion, is the idea that what you do matters and your choices matter, and not participating is a choice to not participate as well.
Right.
And by saying that to people, I think is really, really profound, because the unconscious narrative in America, especially with this administration, is that undocumented people don't matter, people under the age of 18 don't matter, that transgender people don't matter, that working class Americans and the poor don't matter. Like if you want to know what the subconscious narratives, who we say doesn't matter in society, just look at the words that we're either not really allowed to say or are unpopular, the groups that are unpopular to address. Like people love to say working class, but what about poor people? And we say that word working class, but so much of the working class is poor. But it's like politically unfeasible to say that, because all work has dignity. And it's hard to admit that our nation has kind of slid to that place. But I think it's really important to kind of point those specific things out and to say, yes, those people matter.
Yeah.
That matters. And as a politician, it's like, you know, as someone that's running for office, that's supposed to be like, you know, radioactive. Mm-hmm. Don't talk about the poor. Don't go there. Don't talk about immigrants. But
yeah, and I really connect with that. Like, for example,
you know?
One of the things that really gets to me is when, you know, we're talking about raising the minimum wage so people can survive on their job, right? And some people respond to that by saying something like, well, people don't deserve $15 an hour for flipping burgers, mm-hmm. right? As if like that's looked down upon, but mm-hmm. it's a job.
Yeah.
Like people are doing that, and it deserves dignity, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's such a key thing to stress.
And that's straight from King too. All labor has dignity. All work has dignity. And even if you wanted to just like extract all of the morals from that conversation, if you wanted to extract all the values from that conversation, if you wanted to think about it purely in economic or logic-driven way, which I would still argue is not logical, but if you wanted to just like strip all sense of morality, value, etc. from it, at its core level, the cost of an input is the cost it takes to produce that input. So we don't complain when the price of oil goes up. We don't complain we don't like try to stop
the whole system.
Yeah, we don't put like a cap or whatever on the cost of oil or on the cost of gasoline, or you know, if you're a bag maker, you don't demand a cap on the cost of leather or anything like that. But people fight raises in minimum wage. But the thing is, like, the thing about minimum wage is a living wage. It's the amount it costs to live. It's the amount it costs to be alive in our society without being exploited without starving, without having housing instability. You know, it's the cost of being a human being in our society. And federally, that is $15 pegged to inflation. But, you know, even in some cities, it's higher. So I know that's shocking for a lot of people, but we have to make that decision. And as a society, we need to demand that the cost of labor is the cost to be alive.
Absolutely. And I find that incredible and so refreshing, because the idea that there's this conflict between those that want to stand up and protect different people's identities of representation, and how that a lot of times is seen as antagonistic to class and economics. Yeah. And it's so ridiculous, you know, and it's so refreshing to hear a politician that gets both. Yeah. That it's not either or. Yeah. That it's respecting people's backgrounds and where they come, and not, you know, not marginalizing people, not encouraging and pushing people into the shadows, and at the same time understanding that class matters, work matters, labor matters, and that it's like a fundamental part of who we are as a society.
Yeah. I mean, these issues are intersectional. I was just kind of talking on Twitter earlier today that people were like, oh no, like it's not racism, it's economics. Racism is economic. Racism is economic. Economics is one of the many ways that enforces kind of racist structures, power structures. And that's encoded in economics, it's encoded in poll taxes and voter suppression.
Redlining.
And redlining in so many different ways. Yeah. And these things are not separate. And it's unsurprising when, for example, people join a union. Unions are some of the best wage protections, and they're some of the best labor protections for women and people of color. They are profound engines of social mobility for traditionally vulnerable communities. It's not just for one person. You know, we think of a union and people just think of like a car factory in the Midwest.
Right.
And it is that, and it is unionized fast food workers and faculty and journalists and
graduate students.
And people are even trying to kind of sow that class division among this kind of renewing labor movement as well. Now they're saying, oh, like only white collar or like privileged jobs can unionize nowadays. So as if that's some kind of argument to toss out the whole idea of unions altogether. Yeah. And instead of just bolstering that movement to protect more economically vulnerable people. But we all know the most economically vulnerable people fall along a wealth, income, and racial gap.
Right.
Homelessness is very high among the LGBTQ community, and among the mentally ill, and among veterans. And you can't ignore identity in that and just say, okay, well then just worry about homelessness, or okay, just worry about wages. Because at the end of the day, in order to implement those things, you have to organize people. And if you can't go into these communities and organize them, then you're not going to get those economic policies passed. Yeah. If you can't organize Latino communities, if you can't organize African American communities, and you don't have the cultural competency or the relationships to build those coalitions, then it's just an academic pipe dream.
Right.
You gotta make it happen.
And I think that's just a great place to transition into what your campaign is really representing. Mm-hmm. So a year ago in Texas, you kind of announced to this closed circle that you're gonna do it, you're gonna run. And one of the things that I've seen that I was actually talking about with some of the members of NHI, of National Hispanic Institute, was that you represent a social movement campaign. Yeah. And that seems to be the key to be able to do the unthinkable, which is pull this off. Yeah. And get to where, and even get on the ballot, which was seen as a huge challenge and hurdle for you. Yeah. And you've been able to do all these things and more because you have a social movement-based campaign. Mm-hmm. What is that like? What does it mean to have a social movement campaign? What does that consist of?
So you're 100% right. And when I first started this campaign, that was the condition under which I kind of agreed to myself that I would do this, because I don't know how a lot of people I'm running for office, and I don't know how a lot of people run for office. I don't know how a person can just organize around like me, you know,
right.
like slave away like 12 hours a day for me, you know. I could never do
Politicians do that?
Yeah, I really couldn't. It has to be for a vision.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be for something real. It has to be for an uncompromised campaign, a campaign that doesn't take money from special interests, a campaign that pushes not only as part of what is already happening, like Medicare for all and tuition-free college, but is also part of moving the needle forward, like with the federal jobs guarantee or abolishing ICE. Like, it really needs to be a movement. And so I really consider myself a movement candidate. And people say, you know, what's so special about you? And there's nothing special about me. It's this movement that we're creating, and it's the idea that we need to bring this movement to the Bronx. We need to bring it to Queens. We need to bring it to New York City, because you know, there really isn't a strong progressive new candidate in New York City, really. And I think it's really important to bring that movement. And so from the beginning, I had a vision of turning over the keys to activist groups, bringing them together and turning over the keys to our policy. And so bringing together labor groups, bringing together immigration organizing groups, bringing together criminal justice reform groups, and say, what is it do we need to do in our country? Okay, then let's do it. Let's put it on the platform. And so I've been really unafraid to come out on these stances that people think are like, you know, really kind of big or major or risky, because I know that we need to start bringing these ideas into the fold. We need to start talking about these things. And I say so often in our campaign that no one person should be essential to this campaign, including me. Mm-hmm. Because like there should be no one person, and that's really what a movement is. Like, a movement needs everybody, but it also can't depend on one person.
Right.
And that has been so critical to this campaign. I want everybody to know what this vision is and how we're going to accomplish it, so that, let's say, you know, knock on wood, if I can't be the candidate tomorrow, someone else can be the candidate and our movement presses forward. Because no matter what, like, the train has left the station. The train has left the station. We're legalizing marijuana. We're getting a $15 minimum. We're having a federal job. You cannot stop this.
Yeah.
You cannot stop this.
Yeah.
And I started this, and we did this because I wanted to bring it to my community, because I know that our community is emblematic of what we can accomplish in America, and our community can stand to benefit the most. Or benefit a ton from what we can accomplish nationally, and also we can lead the country in these kinds of things. And like, in terms of the Democratic Party or whatever partisan politics, our district is 85% Democrat, and then it's another 10% independent, and then it's like 5 to 8% Republican. So the fact that a district that is so strongly liberal is being wasted on an incumbent that is centrist and corporate and takes no risks and introduces no ambitious legislation is a lost opportunity.
It's a tragedy.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
It's a lost opportunity. Because you see it on the Republican side, on their deepest red districts, they've got some Looney Tunes out there.
Right.
And the fact that there is no strong, cohesive, logical, and bold response to that, and that the response to these people saying that, like, you need to strip people's citizenship away, super right wing. The idea that the response to that is like this tepid 10% better deal nonsense is not sustainable. It's not tenable.
Right. So across the country, let's say there's people watching this, listening to you speak, and they say to themselves, I want to be a part of a social movement. I want to run for office or something like that. What do you say to them? How does one begin to engage in movement politics and perhaps a social movement-based campaign?
Well, I think the hardest thing that people run into when they try to do that is that they deny that it's not about them. They deny that they want to do it for the movement, but there's a lot of ego caught up there.
Yeah.
There's so much ego caught up there that I think it stumbles a lot of people. So there's this catch-22, it's like this Washington paradox where the people who should lead are not the people who desperately want positions of leadership. And so it creates this catch-22 that is slightly sociopathic connotations.
Right.
And so there's kind of some trip ups right there out of the gate. And so, but what I do think is that a lot of those folks, in a way, it kind of takes care of itself and it stops and starts, because a person may want to go in and say, hey, I want to change the world, you knock on the door of Black Lives Matter and they say, hey, can you join us in our movement? And I'll tell you, the initial response of any activist movement is going to be no. And they are right, because they don't want their causes to be co-opted. They don't want and that is what is happening right now, because there's a lot of pop justice politics going on.
Right.
And now it's
hashtag woke.
Yeah, hashtag woke or whatever. But now it's okay. So I'll say a little bit how I did it. I feel is that when an activist movement or when a community that is mobilizing sees you putting your butt on the line and taking really major risks to stand with them, then they will consider you as part of the movement. The way that you do this is not saying, how do I run for office? The way that you do it is that you say, how do I join the movement? How do I join the movement? And then running for office is secondary. So when I first started to run, which was 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I don't know, time is...
It's all a blur.
It's all a blur. Saying as a candidate, Black Lives Matter was so polarizing.
Yeah.
It was not the pop mainstream thing that it is today, where now you've got U.S. Senate and 2020 candidates saying Black Lives Matter. And now Twitter has a custom emoji for BLM. It was not at that level back then. And it was still a somewhat polarizing, ostracizing thing.
Well, I know some Democrats, for example, had consultants telling them, no, don't say that.
Pretty recently too.
Right.
Very recently. And so there still is that which to me is ridiculous. But anyways, I also come from a different kind of community where it to me is such a given. But so for me as a political candidate, before I even asked for an endorsement or anything like that, it's not about endorsements. It's about relationships.
Yeah.
And you need to build true, authentic relationships. And the way that you do that in a movement is that you give, and then you ask. And when you ask, if they say no, you keep giving anyway. Because that is what movement is about. That's what solidarity is about. It's values-based. And I still do that today. New York politics is crazy. There are groups that, brand themselves as really progressive that at their core have machine ties, and when the machine wants to twist its arm, the progressive group will sometimes fall. But so when I get that call of, you know, an executive director from a progressive group, they call me with their tail between their legs, and they say, "I'm so sorry, our organization has chosen to endorse your Wall Street funded opponent." My response isn't to slam the door. You know, my response isn't to say, "You guys are hypocrites." My response is to say, "Let me know when you have your next rally, and if you need me there, I'll be there." And because like really what movements are about, what I believe movement politics is about is it is like that radical, and it's really a politics of love. That's what I try to tell people. We are practicing a politics of love, and love should not be conditional. And if you stand with that person on their values, if a group is trying to advance a value, advance a position that you believe in, then, you know, you just have to kind of continue advancing that line, and you just build where you kind of want to build. And it's kind of like the way raindrops form, and then before it starts to rain. So it's like in order for a raindrop to form, you need a microscopic piece of dust, and then once you have that microscopic piece of dust, then you get condensation around that dust. And then on a larger level with the cloud, that kind of condensation stays in the air until that starts happening all over in the atmosphere, and then it reaches a breaking point,
tipping point,
and it starts to rain.
Yeah.
And so
you're out here making it rain.
And so now it's just about making it rain.
Yeah.
But for a really long time,
It's just working it.
it was just working it, and it was, you know, it was just meeting with groups that were 5-10 people, and you know, even with groups of 5-10 people, they say, "I don't know," you know, and then you just keep working it. You'll find someone. You'll find someone, and then that starts, and then it kind of starts bringing in other groups. But it took so long to make this kind of stuff. I mean, I say so long, but it really took for me like a year and a half, almost 2 years of tilling the soil, because at the core of every movement is trust. But you're not going to make a movement campaign happen in 6 months. You're not going to make it happen in 3 months before an election day. You really need to be part of a movement for a year, 2 years, building relationships, because that's what it's all about. And really, like one of the issues with money in politics is that it is seen as transactional. It is seen as, I'm going to swoop in here 6 months before an election, plop a bunch of cash, and I'm going to win. And that's how a lot of people have tried to run. And that is also why a lot of representatives are so out of touch with the values of their community.
Yeah. Wow, it's crazy because I really get the feeling of the way that so many things are connected, because hearing you speak about this and about movement politics strikes me as how important it is to have healthy relationships across the board.
Yeah.
Right? It's like having a healthy relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
Having a healthy relationship with your family members, your partners, people close to you.
Oh my goodness.
Having a healthy relationship with your community, with your society, with your country, right? It's all about like trust.
Yeah.
It's all about learning to listen.
Yeah.
And that's difficult. So what are your thoughts on that? And how have you kind of learned to be reflective about yourself? And because I think we all have egos.
Yeah.
You know, but it's kind of, in my opinion at least, it's kind of about learning to become aware of the different ways our ego gets manifested and triggered and things like that.
This process forces you to be better in a lot of different ways. It certainly forced me to be better. You know, I think that like we all have our baggage, and we all have our stuff. And when you are in a movement, whether you're practicing like movement politics, or whether you're a candidate, or whether you are leading a group, or whatever it is, there's a certain amount of like health that you need to have, not just physical, but mental, spiritual, etc. And eventually, like as things start growing and growing, you know, you can try to ignore it, but as things start growing and growing, you have to address it. Like, you have to address it. And for me, there have been a couple points in this process. One is that one of the first things you learn, not just as a candidate, but as any person in a movement, there's this like infamous term. There's like this infamous term, the story of self. You have to learn to tell your story of self.
Right.
And that can be really, really, really hard if there are things about yourself that you are insecure about, or if you struggle with loving yourself, which I certainly did at the start of my campaign. I felt like there were so many aspects to my life that were marked by failure. Like when you're forced to tell people, like, why should I vote for you? And then you're like,
you go through your mind like,
and then you're like, why should
they vote for me?
yeah. And so when I first had to kind of tell my story, it was so hard. It literally felt like ripping my arm off, because I had to just say, like, yeah, like, you know, I grew up in this tenuous status between working class and poor, and you internalize a lot of things about yourself and your identity and your self-worth growing up that way. And like, I had dealt with so much pain in the financial crisis. My father had passed away at the peak, and then I graduated college, and I was, you know, in your early 20s, you struggle so much with your identity and who you are, and then feeling like a failure because of the economic position that my family was in, having to do whatever I was doing, but also like waitressing and bartending and dealing with this like stigma of class, and dealing with this stigma of even friends that I love saying, like, what are you doing? And that was like while I was doing organizing work and stuff like that. But it was certainly one of those things where it's like there's so much there that you have to kind of resolve with yourself. And that's really, it's like, so the beginning of the campaign, when I first had to tell my story and figure out, like, I knew that this was something that we needed to do. I knew that and in a big way too, that's also kind of eased my shoulders being a movement candidate as well, because I don't have to be the perfect, you know, messiah figure deserving of people's vote.
Right.
I try to conduct myself, and I've always tried to conduct myself as honorably as I can, with integrity. I do my best given like my circumstances and my conditions, but every once in a while, you know, I'll be human and I'll have a failure. But when I run a campaign that's not predicated on this projection of perfectness,
yes,
which I think is like what is so broken about our politics today.
So broken.
It's so broken. That's why, like, when you see
our culture in general.
Our culture in general is broken, because you have to like project this idea of perfection, which it does not exist. Which, when you project that, forces people to compensate in deeply unhealthy ways, manifests in very deeply unhealthy ways. And also, when you look at some of these guys in DC and they all look like a bunch of like robotic dorks, it's like, you're like, what is going on? Like, there was, you know, you look at people like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or
the most robotic of them all.
Yeah, the most robotic of them all. And you're like, how did they get that way? Well, part of it is our culture. Part of it is our political culture. That because we don't have candidates that are tied to movements, and we don't have candidates that are tied with truly strongly well-defined ideas and movements, then what happens is that it becomes Why should I vote for you? Oh, because I'm perfect, because I went to Harvard Law, because I've had a 4.0 since I was in the 3rd grade, because you know,
this person endorses me.
Because this person
I got
endorses
so much
me.
money from this super PAC.
Yeah, and because like I have 3 kids and they dress like super perfect, and we go to church on Sundays, and like, and then you have to like show the world. It's like this performance art instead of something that's like a little bit more real in our government. And so yeah, so I, you know, it's totally been a journey, and then there, you know, it is a trip, but it does force you to be healthy and to kind of step your game up and to work on those relationships. And it's been true, like it's helped me build my family relationship. Usually this thing is like the opposite, but in a way it's like it forces me to be better so that I can be the best I can be for this campaign and for this movement.
Wow, amazing. So let's go now from the deep, the personal, the spiritual. Let's go now to the theoretical, to the policy world.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
To what you're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
To your district. Now, one of the things that I think was fascinating was in the last year, while all these things are happening in the media, there's also a lot of movement happening, like with different groups connecting with one another. And something that I think is really, really cool about your story and our friendship is the way that here in New York City, we were kind of doing our own thing, and then our worlds collided again.
Yeah.
In that, for months, close to a year, I had been working with many scholars and academics and activists in the world of policymaking and economics. And one of the ideas that was floating around was a federal jobs guarantee. But nobody had heard about it kind of in the mainstream. It was a wish for some kind of future. And around that time, you launched your campaign. And things happened to where you're able to connect with some of the foremost economists and policy thinkers on this issue. Stephanie Kelton, Pavlina Shevnerva, and you start speaking with them. What was that like? And at what point did you decide that you wanted to lend your support to a federal jobs guarantee for all Americans?
Well, I kind of come from the seat, and the way that I generally tend to feel overall is that we do live in the wealthiest nation in the history on Earth, history of Earth. And I feel like wherever we have the capacity, you know, if you can imagine, like, you know, okay, you live in the wealthiest society that has ever existed. What goes on there? You know, what goes on in the wealthiest country on Earth? Beyond anyone's imagination. And at a bare minimum, what I think is, okay, everyone has enough food to survive. Everyone has shelter. Everyone is, you know, productive to the extent that they can be productive. And, you know, everyone can access basic health care. And that is like, you know, the
good society.
The good society.
Right.
And so the way I feel is that these are all things that we would love, right? We would love everyone to have a home. We would love everyone to have health care. We know that these are things that we would want. So instead of just saying, oh, like, that would be nice, but it can't happen, if we reassess those basic presumptions and say, well, if it could happen, if we could make it happen, how would we make it happen? And when I see people doing that kind of work, that figure out ways that we can have a good society, not just a society where there is money somewhere, but that we have a good society where people feel like they live in a prosperous society, then why not we figure out how to do that? isn't it kind of a moral imperative if we know what the good society is and we know that we're capable of being that good society? It's kind of incumbent on us to make it happen. And when I see people doing the work and we see a plan and a way to make it happen, then I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to try to make it happen.
Right.
Instead of just saying, let's be realistic. Did we get to the moon by saying, let's be realistic? Do we have Bitcoin or, whatever these things are? In our modern innovation, do we have the internet because someone said, let's be realistic? No, these things happen because we worked backwards from our goals. We said, what would it be like if we went to the moon? How if we were to go to the moon, how would we get there? Okay, and then you figure it out and you're like, well, it looks like it's possible to go to the moon and we want to go to the moon, so let's go to the moon. And it was never that's how every ambitious advancement in human society has ever happened. It's by deciding and having the vision of what we wanted to accomplish and working backwards from there, instead of having this vision and say, no, it's not realistic.
Right. And a lot of people act as though things like policy making and monetary systems and money itself is some kind of natural thing that has kind of always existed in nature. It's always been the same. It's maybe like laws of physics or something.
Right.
When in reality, these are historical things that we have created. Human beings have come together and we've designed these systems. And so, when I hear people like you speak, I get the hope of the possibility that we can come together to imagine, what are we going to use money for? What are we going to use monetary systems for? We have the resources.
Yeah.
We have the people. We have the intellect. We have the capacity. Let's mobilize it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And we have a country that is so badly underutilizing its potential.
Yeah, our monetary and fiscal system lacks cohesion with our core purpose. And that speaks a lot to your point, that it's not just about inflation or controlling inflation. It's about, those are the tools, those are the mechanisms. But what good is it if we have the largest amount of dollars if everybody is starving? What good is that bank account number if we have a society that we're ashamed of? Because New York City has the highest level of homelessness since the Great Depression. What good is having all of those zeros in the bank account when children can't feed themselves, when there's lead in schools, when the pipes in Flint aren't fixed? What good is it? Are you proud? Are we going to tap ourselves on the back because there's more dollars that have ever existed before? And
where are they? Where are they sitting?
Of dubious, nature.
Right.
We need to measure ourselves by the physical society and the physical society that we live in and what we're actually accomplishing as a society. And that is what we need to really be measuring our success by. We're not the first ones to say this. This goes back to Robert F. Kennedy when he talks about when he, and even before then, but it goes back to the social and economic and political activists in the 60s and the 70s when they're saying, why do we measure our success by GDP? This doesn't make any sense. When we talk about how work and labor is given dignity by the fact that it is given a living wage. That is what gives work dignity, the fact that you can live on it, that you can raise a family on it. So why don't we just make it happen? We can make it happen.
Right. Yeah, and so many economists and policy wonks throw around a lot of numbers, but people don't really take into account, for example, the costs of just unemployment and homelessness.
Yes.
The future costs,
yes.
The psychological costs, the cultural costs. I mean, I'm not a believer that everything should be monetized and quantified, but the destruction and the pathology that comes from these things.
And on the converse, the fact that we don't quantify the costs of not doing the right thing I think is actually
Right.
part of the problems in our
Sure.
society. Because, you get these numbers, like, how much does homelessness cost? It's like, oh, like 6 billion, whatever. Does a corporation have to incorporate the externality cost of their impact on homelessness or health? Or, like, could you imagine if Walmart actually had to pay for had to pay for the cost of not providing their employees adequate health care? Like, what these externalities are not being quantified. And because they're not being quantified, they don't exist. The negative impacts don't exist because our society has been trending to be like only like IPO capitalist. So if it doesn't exist on the stock market, if it's not
value
part
of
of
shares,
if it's not part of a profit margin or a portfolio, then the value of it doesn't exist. But that thing does have value. The environment does have value, but those externalities are not forced in the price of certain things. It's not forced in the price of gasoline. Climate change is not forced into the price of a tank of gas. And so I think that it's so incredibly true. I mean, if we had healthcare, and if every single person in America was able to get the mental health care that we would need, our population experiencing homelessness would drop. Our population that is struggling with job insecurity would drop. Like, all of these things, drug addiction, all of these things are interconnected. And to act as though, they're not, and to only look at things solely through a fiscal lens and not look at things in the broader scope, I think is a huge mistake.
Let's talk about climate change. What is your perspective, your position on where we are now and the things that the country really needs to address the approaching catastrophe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my community, our district, is so profoundly impacted by this problem. We have 3 peninsular communities in New York 14. I was just at one last night. They already have a 2-foot storm surge or a 2-foot sea level rise at their door. The seawall in College Point has already collapsed. The soil is starting to degrade in these communities. In fact, for so long, real estate developers, it's not a new problem. For so long, luxury real estate developers have participated in illegal activities in the city, one of those things being illegal dumping. And so now that the seawall is broken, now that we have a 2-foot rise in sea level in our communities, it's pulling out old dumps from the past, from underneath the oil. So people are walking around in our communities and they're finding trash from the 1920s World Fair. It is here. It is here. And I do not believe that we can wait for some corporation or cap and trade or ExxonMobil, like, to leave it to them to do something about it. Their job is to sell gasoline, and that is what they are designed to do. That is not going to save our planet, and it has to, we are at a point where it has to be we need to mobilize on the level of world war, but for rebuilding our infrastructure and changing to a renewable energy economy. And we have to do it fast. And we see that, again, we see that it is possible. And we see that we are capable of doing that, but we have to be ruthless in our pursuit of doing it. And we cannot half-step our way out of this. We really can't. If we want to leave a planet that we are at least somewhat comfortable leaving to our children when we pass, we need to act like right now. And I think that needs to be done with a Green New Deal. I think it needs to be done with a massive program of infrastructure mobilization and development. I think that we needed that, like, the fact that we're still building oil and fossil fuel pipelines in this country is so backwards and so wrong. And you know, at least on the topic of climate change, it's hard because I think, I imagine the conversations that I would have with my children or grandchildren one day, and I want to be able to tell them that I did everything that I could, but I also don't want to tell them that we failed.
What is one other policy that you carry with you where you go that you find of urgent importance?
Well, our community is very young. We have a lot of families in our community. So when we talk about tuition-free college to families in their communities, it really is like identity shifting for these families and for these communities to say, you can send your kid to college if that is what your kid wants. You can send your kid to a vocational or trade school if that is what your kid wants. It is like identity shifting for families, because when you grow up and you have a kid and you grow up working class, there's always that thing in the back of your head, like there's that timer running backwards from like 0 to 18 years old. And I feel like there's so much anxiety that parents have, and like this like secret shame, feeling like I don't know what I'm going to tell my kid when it's time for them to go to college. I don't know if I can just, like, do I tell them to not even think about it? Like, what do I do? And we really are at the point in our society where our economic development demands educational expansion. We do this all the time in the United States. When the United States first started, people had, second grade literacy, and that was the most. We just taught people to read, and we maybe taught people to count and do some basic arithmetic, and like that was it as a society. And like maybe if you were the elite of the elite, you got private tutoring and access to much higher forms of education.
Right.
But then we decided as a society that if we're gonna evolve, then we need to have nationalized middle school. And then we did that. And then 100 years later, we nationalized high school. We only just got nationalized high school in 1950. That was in the United States. People think we've always had high school.
Yeah.
High school just finished expanding in the United States 60, 70 years ago.
Wow.
And now, as our economy changes, so like that first change was 150 years. Now, from like middle school to high school, like 100 years, 150 years. Now, from middle school to, now from like nationalized high school to college, now it's 70 years. Because as our technology develops, our iterations get shorter and shorter, and our educational expansion needs to happen on that same scale. And so we have to nationalize and have a K through 16 system. Before it was K through 2, then it was K through 6, K through 8, then it was K through 12, and now we need K through 16. And it's not to say they're going to be in public school until as college, but it's to say that everybody needs to have access and the ability, and to not be economically excluded from a higher education. Because how else there's so much about economic projections. Like with US projected economic growth, the dirty little secret that a lot of people don't tell you is that there is an alpha. So like the formula for projecting economic growth in the United States, why this thing kind of keeps going up, is because it's like, X plus 2 alpha, or there's an alpha. And what that alpha is, what that multiplier mystery, mystery multiplier is innovation. And so there is a given level of innovation that is assumed in the United States that gets incorporated into our projections of economic growth. If we are not making the investments to justify that innovation multiplier, which is access to an education, then these projections are all wrong. They're all wrong. And the thing is like, we just assume that we're just going to innovate our way out of problems or innovate our way to constant growth. But if we're doing nothing to actually have an innovative society, then it's all nonsense.
Right.
Then it's all nonsense. What are we doing to invest in our innovative capacity as a country? When we are, like, even before you get to college, we have starved out our public education system, and we aren't expanding it, increasing it. We aren't bringing it to college. So we need to invest in that alpha.
And it seems as though there's also a question of what does innovation really mean to us?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just kind of inventing new widgets that we're gonna like have fun with, or is it really about innovation to meet the human mental, psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs that we all have to develop as people, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Any last words that you have?
I don't know. I always try to take the last word opportunity. I think it's just, the last word is really, if you're out there, like, do whatever the thing that is bugging you in your brain, and to be persistent about it, because that is probably the thing that our society needs. And like, if there's anyone out there that's listening, that's on the cusp of doing something, this is your permission to do it. Because take risks and to do that thing, because I certainly needed that too. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We had an awesome time.
Yeah, totally.
And make sure to catch us next time. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.